Good evening. Thank you for coming out to the Center for Inquiry again for our debate. Tonight, the Center for Inquiry is hosting a very special debate on a very special topic, and it is my pleasure to introduce our two participants in the debate. Let me first introduce myself. My name is John Shook. I'm Vice President for Education and Research here at the Center for Inquiry in Amherst, New York. The debate topic, God probably exists. Our two participants are Eddie Tabash and the most Irreverend Ronald, Bishop of the Church of Near Universal Damnation. Eddie Tabash is a constitutional lawyer in the Los Angeles area. He graduated magna cum laude from UCLA in 1973 and took his law degree from Loyola University of Los Angeles in 1976. He chairs the Center for Inquiry Los Angeles and is on the board of directors of the Center for Inquiry Transnational and the Council for Secular Humanism. He also chairs the Council's First Amendment Task Force. He has represented the Center and the Council in briefs before the United States and California Supreme Courts in separation of church and state cases. He is one of the more noted atheist debaters in this country. He has debated the issue of does God exist and does the Christian God exist against such world-class religious philosophers as William Lane Craig, Douglas Gavette, and Richard Swinburne. The most Irreverend Ronald, Bishop of the Church of Near Universal Damnation, is a recognized scholar and demagogue. He holds 3 separate doctorates in theology from the universities of Frankfurt on Main, Newcastle upon Tyne, and Salami on Rye. He is the author of over a dozen books and shamelessly takes credit for at least 2 dozen more. Among his titles are the notoriously ignored books in the series Assertions, Reassertions, Reassertions, 2nd edition, and I take back what I just said. Dr. Atheist has sparred with believers and non-believers alike, as indicated by his recent polemics against Pastor Rick Warren. Warren doesn't know a purpose from a porpoise, and Obama should have invited me. Although he usually doesn't prepare for debates, when informed that he was going to be debating a lawyer tonight, Dr. Atheist did engage in special preparation by hiding his wallet. Please join me in welcoming our two participants. The instructions for the debate are very simple. The format's quite simple. The pleasure of going first is to Dr. Atheist, and we will have 2 10-minute opening statements, followed by 2 10-minute replying statements from each, followed by each giving their own 5-minute closing time. Following that, I believe that the two participants have graciously agreed to take a few questions from the audience, as long as they're not too hard. Please, Dr. Atheist.
Thank you. I'm going to hook myself up here. I always like to be plugged into things. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to the Center for Iniquity. It's a pleasure being here. I do want to take the time to make one small announcement. It's because my church is growing rapidly. We have a need for more altar boys and girls, and I'd be happy to conduct private interviews after the debate here tonight. So please contact me if you're interested. Now, I know you're a bunch of heathens here and infidels, but I'm sure you'll respect my right to engage in silent prayer for a moment. I always do this before debate to seek divine inspiration, so please bear with me. Oh, and my prayers have been answered. The first proof of God's existence. If Hitchens can do it for your side, I can do it for my side. So here we go. God only gives the best. Alvin. Not bad. All right. Well, you know, I had occasion to actually to look at your website and your mission statement. I'm not sure why I decided to do that, but I took a look at it. Very long, by the way. I think you need to shorten it just a bit. That's a word of advice. But I noticed that one of the things you say in there, I mean, you talk a lot about how you believe in science and reason, which I found very interesting because I believe atheism is incompatible with science and reason, which I'll demonstrate to you in a few moments. One of the statements on your website, for example, is that this is under some heading of, my goodness, how long is this thing? A method of inquiry. You know, there are footnotes and whatever, and numbered points. The first numbered point is first, mass/energy and physical/chemical laws are in some sense the basic building blocks of the physical universe. I could not agree more. And as I'm sure all of you are familiar with, the basic point from physics is that there's a conservation of energy. Basically, in layman's terms, you can't get something from nothing. But that's what atheists believe. You can get something from nothing. The universe is just there. Well, what's the explanation for the universe? Obviously, we need a being that's not contingent, that is necessary. And traditionally, that being, a necessary being, has been called God. I think I've given you a handout. There should have been a handout here passed with an outline of one of my arguments. And it sets this forth in a more logical form. This argument, by the way, was, I think, originally put forth by St. Thomas Aquinas. I've modified it a bit because one of the counter-arguments made against Aquinas is that he assumed there was a finite period of time. That, in other words, the universe was created ex nihilo. There was a period of time when things didn't exist, and therefore, you know, we need God as an explanation. And some atheists have said, well, that improperly assumes there's a finite period of time. What if we had an infinite period of time? Well, the virtue of my argument is it shows whether you believe things have been around for an infinite period of time or for a finite period of time, you still need something to explain it. The argument's there for you, so I won't go through it step by step, but you know, the first point is either things have existed for an infinite period of time or for a finite period of time. It's a logical truth. I mean, it's either or, so I assume everyone accepts that. If things have been around for an infinite period of time, then each set of entities that can occur has occurred at some point or another. This is an implication from the concept of infinity. If the only things that exist are contingent, that is, things that are not necessarily in existence, that need some sort of explanation, then one possibility is that at some point before now, nothing existed, because one can have a null set. In other words, a set where there's nothing in existence. Therefore, if there have been things around for an infinite period of time, and the only things that exist are contingent, that at some point before now, nothing existed. That's a logical conclusion. I think my logic is impeccable. If there are any logicians in the room, they can question that. Number 5. Of course, if there's only been an infinite amount of time, and the only things that exist are contingent, that at some point, nothing existed. Before the beginning of time, nothing existed, right? I think everyone should be in agreement on that, right? Therefore, if the only things that exist are contingent, in other words, the only things that exist are things that cannot explain themselves, that need some sort of explanation, then whether time has been finite or infinite, at some point before now, nothing existed. Because something cannot come from nothing, if at some point before now nothing existed, then nothing can exist now. This is a scientific law accepted by physicists, accepted by scientists, accepted and indeed proclaimed by you on your very website. So how can you take issue with that unless you want to disavow your mission statement? There may be other reasons to disavow the mission statement, but I assume that's not one of them. If the only things that exist are contingent, then nothing can exist now. That's the conclusion from the foregoing premises. It's false that nothing exists now. Proof? Look around the room. You exist, right? You're undecided, okay. but I assume most people would agree here that they exist, there are things existing. Well, therefore, it's false that the nothing exists now. If that's the case, but we need an explanation for contingent things, there must be a necessary being. That being is called God. QED. That's one argument for the proof of the existence of God. I believe it's irrefutable. I'm sure my esteemed but depraved colleague may come up with some sort of response, and I eagerly wait to hear what he has to say. But I have another argument as well. This is the so-called fine-tuning argument. And again, it borrows heavily from science. Contrary to the aspersions often cast upon believers, we very much believe in physical laws and in science. And what science has shown us is that the present universe as a whole, including life within the universe, has to have certain minimal physical requirements. And there's a whole long list of things that had to fall in place for there to be a universe, let alone life within the universe, such as a long-term stable source of energy, a large number of different chemical elements, and so forth. In order to meet these minimal requirements, certain physical constants, such as the gravitational constant, and the ratios between these physical constants needed to be within a narrow range of values. The slightest change to any of these physical constants would have resulted in either no universe or a universe inhospitable to life. To take just one example, I'm here going to be quoting from Stephen Hawking, clearly not someone who's known as a religious fundamentalist. He has said, there has to have been a very close balance between the competing effect of explosive expansion at the beginning of the universe and gravitational contraction, which at the very earliest epoch about which we can even pretend to speak, which is called the Planck time, that's 10 to the minus 43 after the Big Bang, would have corresponded to an incredible degree of accuracy represented by a deviation in the ratio from unity of 1 part in 10 to the 60th. That's a huge number. So to say the least, it's highly improbable that this fine-tuning, in other words, the fine-tuning of a set of initial conditions that resulted in the universe and in you sitting here today, could have resulted by chance. I mean, you can say, well, yeah, that's possible. Yes, there is a very, very, very slight possibility, namely at least something in the magnitude of 10 to the 60. But that seems highly unlikely, to say the least. And remember, our resolution tonight is it's probable that God exists. I don't have to prove beyond any doubt whatsoever that God exists, just as more probable to believe in the existence of God. Given the fine-tuning of the universe, we have to say that the universe we have, which supports life, is either due to chance or design. Well, to say the least, it's highly improbable it's due to chance. Therefore, the fine-tuning of the universe has to be due to design. We need a designer, and again, traditionally, that designer is identified with God. So with those two devastating arguments, I think I've established my case conclusively, but nonetheless, I eagerly await what my opponent has to say. Thank you.
Does everybody have a copy of my handout? If not, can someone? Okay. Mic myself up here. Good evening. I'm very happy the Reverend agreed to debate me. Tonight's debate is on the probability of the existence of God. It's going to be my point that it is more likely than not, by the overwhelming weight of the evidence, that an all-good, all-powerful, all-knowing God does not exist. And my dominant theme will be the lack of evidence of the supernatural and the clear indication from the physical world that the supernatural does not exist. My argument is based on the weight of the evidence and upon the assertion that atheism is the best inference made from the existing evidence. If the supernatural existed, we would have evidence of it today. If I said to you that 2,000 years ago in ancient Buffalo, green gremlins from the sixth dimension abducted members of the native population and imbued them with special powers, and these are now the guardian angels of the entire U.S., you wouldn't believe me because these claims violate the laws of nature as we understand them. Because miracles bear witness against themselves, since by their very nature they're violations of the very laws that are not supposed to be violated. And all the supposed miracles that are used to verify the intervention in human affairs of God allegedly took place in a pre-scientific era. Why not today? How come we don't see those same miracles today? It makes it highly suspect that they were fabricated in the pre-scientific era and therefore are not available today. If we look for the Loch Ness Monster and we scour that lake and it's not there, the best evidence is it does not exist. If you look and don't find, you can infer it's not there. So in this sense, absence of evidence is evidence of absence. Because if a God did exist, there would be some traceable, findable, contemporary evidence of that existence, which would be some evidence of the supernatural. Also, the overwhelming weight of the evidence shows that our consciousness is a byproduct of our brains, and that without a functional cortical neuron and synapses, we cannot think and we cannot have self-awareness. So, for instance, if there were an incorporeal soul, then we would be able to not be affected by an anesthetic or a blow on the head. Alzheimer's disease would not eclipse our consciousness if, in fact, there were an independent soul that was not dependent upon the physical brain and body. So, for instance, the language we speak, our self-awareness comes about through sensory input into a physical brain. If a 2-month-old child dies and pops out into the hereafter, is it a 2-month-old child not speaking a language, having to be educated on the other side? How can we tell ourselves apart from other souls if there is no physical boundary? Every indication is that consciousness is a byproduct of the brain. So that makes not only life after death improbable, it makes God himself improbable, because if we have no example of intelligence that can function without being connected to a nervous system, particularly a functional physical brain, then how would God even think? There is no mechanism by which to demonstrate that a disembodied intelligence, be it a superintelligence or even average human-style intelligence, can exist without a physical brain. Again, the weight of the evidence is against the God hypothesis. Also, if a God exists who is all good and all knowing and all powerful, he would not permit the types of gratuitous evil that we see today in our world. Now, some people might say, well, we need this kind of evil for our free will. But why is free will such a virtue that God has to allow such atrocious suffering? You wouldn't allow one child to horrendously injure another child just so the first child who does the injuring can learn from free will. Also, if God, even before we were created, knew which one of us would be very good and very bad, why wouldn't God exercise some degree of care as to which one of us to be created, because God had a choice as to which one of us to create before we were created, and because he has ultimate foreknowledge, he saw all of us, and because he saw all of us how we would turn out. If certainly you are Sony and you are making CDs, you would not continue to make all those that are defective, and yet God has even more knowledge. Malaria is a terrible disease. There's a gene, though, that provides an effective defense against malaria. It works by destroying any red blood corpuscles that have been occupied by any of the types of parasitic protozoans that cause malaria. But if one has inherited this malaria-fighting gene from both parents, the result is sickle cell anemia. That's not a very, very good design. We also have the question of evolution. Though it is possible on theism, it is more likely on atheism because it is a very wasteful process, with 99% of all species that have ever existed now extinct. We have useless components to our bodies that indeed do more harm than good, like the appendix, known to us when it bursts. Also, evidence of natural selection is established by the weight of the evidence that there's a 100% match of DNA sequence in the pseudogene region of beta globin is proof that humans and gorillas shared a common ancestor. Then we come to the question of divine hiddenness. Why allow reasonable non-belief? If there exists a God who wants us to know him and love him, why is he so hidden? Why doesn't he explain why such evils occur? Why doesn't he demonstrate himself by miracles like he did in pre-scientific biblical times? Why doesn't he manifest himself in such a way? Why doesn't he appear directly to us other than by relying on the ancient hearsay of Scripture? Why has God made belief in him so difficult by not giving us direct evidence today? Also, an aspect of this is the argument from religious confusion. Many Christians disagree with themselves on many items of belief. Part of the New Testament says that mere faith in Jesus is sufficient for salvation. Others requires that good deeds are a prerequisite for salvation. Why isn't this clarified? Why does God allow Eastern Path seekers to meditate and find some sense of a all-pervasive cosmic being, and yet Christians in their prayer think they've contacted a God who will send other people to hell forever just for not believing in Jesus? Certainly, if there is a God, we can expect that he would give us a reliable revelation. If that revelation is defective, as is the Bible with its scientific errors and its many contradictions, that cuts against what a God would do if through our reason we normally expect that there is a God who will provide us with information so that we can rely on his really being there. And then there is the argument from Scale. If there is a God who believes that we are the crowning glory of his creation, well, why then is 96% of the universe either dark matter or dark energy? The universe is so large compared to us. Also, we know from Big Bang cosmology, the Earth is at least 13.7 billion, the universe is 13.7 billion years old. The world is 4.6 billion years old. We humans have existed in our present form for not more than 100,000 years. So why had billions and billions of years passed before we appeared on the stage if we were meant to be the crowning glory of creation? So if you take the universe and the evidence as a whole, the totality of the evidence makes it much more likely than not that God does not exist. Thank you.
Well, I would like to thank my distinguished but thoroughly misguided opponent for his remarks. One thing you'll notice, he started off by talking about the evidence. The evidence, according to him, indicates that God does not exist. One thing, however, you may also have noticed is that my opponent studiously avoided commenting on my two decisive arguments. There is evidence that God exists. I just presented it a few moments ago. Where's the response to that? So I think there is very strong evidence that God exists. I'll await, I hope, eventually, for a response from him on those points. But let me pick up with some of the points he made. He indicated that, well, it's impossible for God to exist because, as far as we know, intelligence depends on a physical brain. That may, in fact, be the case for human beings, that we need a physical brain for intelligence. Not clear whether that has anything to do with a necessary perfect being such as God. He's something that's he, she. Don't want to, preclude any sort of gender variations here. Is a being that is immaterial. Again, that's part of the traditional belief about God. Why can't we have an immaterial intelligence? Now you might say, oh, so you're thinking there's something that's immaterial out there. Well, why not? There are a lot of things that are immaterial that we accept all the time, correct? Sometimes we have material representations of them, so we may have pictures of God or what have you because we need for our own intelligence to have some sort of physical representation, but that doesn't mean that the entity behind the representation is physical. Let me just give you an example. This is the number 2 that I've drawn on here, correct? Number 2. But that's not 2, right? This is a representation of the number 2. Where does the number 2 exist? It's immaterial. All the mathematical equations, mathematical equations that scientists rely upon to explain the universe are immaterial. We have representations on a whiteboard or blackboard or in computers or what have you that give us these equations. Those are just representations of the immaterial mathematical laws. How about values? My opponent talked about, the existence of God is somehow incompatible with alleged evil in the world. That assumes that, I would think, he's indicating there's some sort of objective reality to values. Is a value something physical? I think it's something immaterial. And yet, that immaterial thing can and does influence us. Well, it influences some of us. But in any event, that's an immaterial thing. So we have immaterial things that we rely on all the time. So what's so strange about an immaterial being such as God? Let me pick up with some of his other points. This whole thing about evil, this is kind of a traditional argument that, the bad things that happen in the universe, it shows there can't be an all-loving God, and that is, I admit, one of the attributes attributed to God. Necessary being, omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent. But isn't it the case that when we think about good and bad things, we look at the overall picture? And if in fact we believe that free will is a valuable thing, then bad things that happen as a result of human beings exercising their free will have to be put into the larger picture. And the larger picture indicates that, in fact, the universe is very much compatible with a loving God. Let me just ask people here. Do all of you think it had been better for you if you'd never been born? Is that the case? I mean, isn't it true that most of you, Professor Shook, do you think you should never have been born?
Not today.
Not today, right. Most people think life overall is a very good thing. Yes, bad things happen, but you have to look at the underlying fundamental reality of the goodness of life. Life is good, and if, as I've argued, and I've heard no refutation so far to the contrary, that God is responsible for creating the universe and creating life, He has given us a good that is frankly immeasurable. So yes, bad things happen. No one denies that. But you have to look at the overall picture. And if you look at the overall picture, taking the universe as a whole, taking life as something that's very good, the universe is quite compatible with the existence of a benevolent God. In fact, it demands the existence of a benevolent God. Divine hiddenness. You know, I've never figured out what this argument means. You know, atheists are saying, well, gee, God should give us a clearer sign. Well, first of all, I've given you a couple arguments that prove decisively that God exists. What more do you need, right? He's not hidden to anyone who opens their mind to the reality of God. He's not hidden. Moreover, if you wanted what do you want? You know, God to appear in the sky and say, hey, I'm here, right? Yes. Well, okay. But if you think about that, though, think about this. Haven't you ever in your life been concerned about relationships that maybe you found a little smothering or intimidating? I mean, if God were in your face all the time saying, hey, I'm here, you know, pay attention to me, wouldn't you find that a little troubling? Maybe it caused you a little bit uneasy. Certainly you would feel that you couldn't exercise your free will as you did before, because you'd always be reminded, this is this big guy, woman, whatever, looking over your shoulder. God hasn't hid himself. Again, if you open your eyes, open your mind, if you're not blinded by this atheist claptrap, then you'll recognize that God is there. But he's not going to make it so obvious that, as I said, that he'll smother you, that he'll be just, you know, something you can't ignore. He wants us to exercise our mind. And finally, to get back again to the point about evil, this is something I've never understood about atheist position. You know, they say, oh, God doesn't exist because, you know, there's bad things that happen and God is supposed to be perfect and all good. Well, how can an atheist say anything objectively about evil? Where do your objective standards come from? Now, I'm not, you know, trotting out the argument that some people sometimes have said that atheists can't be good people. I admit atheists, the few of you can be good people. That's kind of by accident. It happens from time to time. But you need, if you're talking about trying to use the existence of evil as a way to disprove God's existence, you need some objective standard for evil and for good. Where does that objective standard come from? From what Mr. Tabash thinks? Why is what he thinks is good any better than what Dr. Shook thinks or anyone else? Atheists simply are relying on their own subjective perceptions. Well, that's no good because, I mean, think of all the different views that people have had throughout history about what's good and bad. How do we arbitrate between those disputes? You need an objective warrant to talk about good and evil. And where does that objective warrant come from? Certainly not from the perceptions of individual humans, given, you know, Mr. Tabash referred to how benighted people were in ancient times. Kind of a gratuitous slap, I think, about some of our ancestors, but that's okay. I mean, they probably did have, some of them had mistaken views about things. We have mistaken views about things. But if we're going to rely on this idea that there's a standard of good that shows, well, gee, there's bad things that happen in the world and therefore God can't exist, we need to appeal to some objective standard, and atheists can't do that because all you're appealing to are your own feelings and perceptions. There has to be a standard out there that validates your judgments, and again, it goes back to the point about an immaterial reality. Mr. Tabash has talked about physical things and whatever, and you have a brain, et cetera, therefore that shows there's no immaterial being. Well, I've already shown you the laws of mathematics are immaterial, values are immaterial, moral laws are immaterial. Therefore, certainly it's quite plausible there can be an immaterial being such as God that lays down the objective laws of the universe, both the laws that govern science and the laws that govern value. Thank you.
The biggest problem with the Reverend's argument from contingency is that he's begging the question. He says that everything that exists has to be contingent on something else. but he gives no explanation as to why God should be exempt from that contingency. So if everything that exists has to be dependent on something else, that also includes God. But you'll notice that he made no justification for that, so that's circular. He's also said that something can't come from nothing, but to say that God created the world out of nothing is just taking that back a step further. If you look at Einstein's general theory of relativity, time and space came into being with the universe and did not pre-exist it. So therefore, though we don't know all the constituent elements of how the universe came about, you can't say, well, God did it, because cause and effect can only occur in a place of sequential time and space for A to cause B. And because the universe did not, time and space did not pre-exist the universe, there is no way for a causative agent to have caused the universe to come about, because we didn't have time and space. So you can't have sequential causation, and there's no way that we can yet figure out exactly what happened, but we certainly know that there can't be a sequential cause and effect as we understand it. Also, the Reverend would then have to explain how an immaterial being with no body or physical attributes could, with pure mentality, bring about matter. That is a very, very inexplicable component. As far as his argument for fine-tuning is concerned, the actual probability of our universe arising has not been demonstrated. He makes the fallacy of, if you're using Bayesian confirmation theory, of having an absence and a lack of the background information you need to demonstrate that the constants in our universe must have required a fine-tuner. For all we know, those laws could not have been different than they are and not even been capable of the fine-tuning. So if I take a vat of paint and throw it on the wall behind me, how each blotch turns out is an infinitesimally small percentage, but it doesn't have any meaning. If I take a single die and roll it and get the numbers after 10 sequential throws, 3, 5, 6, 3, 1, 4, 4, 2, 3, 6, well, this is less than 1 in 60 millionth of a probability, but it's not that ununderstandable, because even though it's unique, it doesn't mean it was designed. It doesn't mean it was planned. It just means that that is what happened. So we don't have any idea of whether or not we could have, for instance, a silicon-based life as opposed to our carbon-based life. There's no reason why that couldn't exist had the universe been put together differently. And also, from what we know about the Big Bang and the inflation that happened right afterwards, if the purpose of the Big Bang was to create a universe hospitable to life, then it should have been possible to predict the outcome of the Big Bang from the initial conditions. But we know that this didn't happen. Now, if you look at the work of Stephen Hawking, he claims that the best we can understand is the universe may be closed, but it is unbounded in the sense that it didn't even have a beginning, which of course dovetails with Einstein's theory of general relativity, that time did not pre-exist the universe. And this is what prompted Carl Sagan to say, well, then there was nothing for a creator to do. Now, the Reverend mentioned that we have immaterial things, but they are not immaterial supernatural things, and they're not things that violate the laws of nature. For instance, we know that the idea of 2 as a number is abstract, but it manifests concretely. I can have 2 fingers or 2 pieces of paper, and that's how 2 manifests. But the fact that we can do that doesn't mean that mind, of which we have evidence can only exist if there's cortical neurons and synapses in a physical brain, is capable of existing. And he said that, well, it's not impossible for consciousness to be immaterial well, we have no basis or evidence that it's possible because the only example we have, as opposed to mathematical numbers and as opposed to certain abstract ideas, the only example we have is that you need a physical brain to think of those abstractions. So even to conceive of such things, you need a physical brain, or consciousness will not come about. Now, he mentioned moral values, but what he failed to talk about is if, in fact, you can only have objective moral values with a lawgiver, where did the lawgiver reveal those values? If it's in the Bible, which the Reverend refuses to acknowledge if it is or it isn't, that's defective because the Bible mandates all those atrocities, the raping of captive women, the killing of little children, sending you to hell forever for not believing in Jesus, and yet, at the same time, the Reverend doesn't show any other place where God imprinted those moral values. Also, if God, in fact, has lodged them in the Bible, then those atrocities are arbitrary with God, which raises the Euthyphro dilemma, and that is, if those values depend on God, are they objectively moral and to be followed by all of us because God commands them, which makes them arbitrary on God's will, or are they values in themselves and God only has the omniscience to recognize them, which means that objective moral values exist independently of God? Now, even if we have trouble finding absolute moral values, that doesn't mean that God exists just so that we have a convenient location for them. It means that moral values evolve as humans evolve, and that we determine them collectively as a body of evolved beings. So, for instance, the Bible says you're supposed to put to death two men who make love with each other, or if somebody picks up sticks on the Sabbath, they're supposed to be put to death, or if they practice witchcraft. Well, is that moral just because it's in the Bible? And if it's not, it means God did not author the Bible. And if God did not author the Bible, where has He imprinted those moral values? So even if He is the author of those moral values, He's not given us a reliable location to find them. And then he says he had trouble recognizing the argument from evil because of all the good in the world. Well, that doesn't justify the evil. My mother was an Auschwitz survivor, and her father was killed at Auschwitz the first day. The fact that his life may have had value doesn't justify God putting him through that. So if you take someone and chop off their arms and legs and keep them in agony for the rest of their lives and say, oh, but you'd still rather exist than not be born, that doesn't justify the pain inflicted. So if I create a race of sentient androids, that doesn't mean I'm justified in tormenting them and torturing them just because I created them. And even if someone might still want to live notwithstanding the pain, that doesn't make the pain all right to inflict. And he said he didn't understand the argument from divine hiddenness, and God couldn't smother us with His presence. We're not talking about God smothering us with His presence. We're talking about God showing enough of Himself so that non-belief would not be reasonable. The fact that non-belief is reasonable, that it is inculpable, that we can't be faulted for not believing, means that God has not revealed enough of Himself to make it plausible to believe. And so if God is withholding evidence so much as to make non-belief reasonable, then God cannot blame us for not believing, which means that God is withholding evidence for many of us to believe in Him, which is inconsistent with the God who wants us to know Him. So again, if you take the totality of the evidence, it is more likely than not that there is no God.
Do you want your notes back? Well, my opponent has delivered a very rhetorically powerful argument, one lacking totally in substance, however. First of all, he begs the question entirely. He has this argument about, oh, well, God had to act in space and time, and then there had to be this sequential causation, and there's no proof of that. Well, time and space began with the physical universe. God didn't act in time and space. He created time and space. So that argument proves nothing. He's trying to impose upon God a structure that's not applicable to God. So again, an irrelevant argument. In fact, my opponent is full of irrelevant arguments. He keeps talking about the Bible. How many times have I invoked the Bible here in my argument? None. I haven't talked about the Bible. I've talked about proofs for the existence of God that should appeal to any intelligent person. And again, God isn't hidden. If you're willing to listen to rational argumentation, there's sufficient proof for the existence of God. So the idea that he's hidden only to those who do not want to hear the truth. And unfortunately, there are all too many of such people. Let's talk about the truth for a second. Because, we're talking about, what's right, what's wrong, not just in a moral sense, but in a factual sense. Well, how do we know that what we think is true is true? What's the warrant not just for moral beliefs, but for factual beliefs? We have to have some assurance that what we think about actually may correspond in some way to reality. If you simply believe that we're here through evolution, that wasn't, and I'm not opposed to evolution, but I think it was God-guided evolution. But if you think it wasn't God-guided, if there's no God there to provide some underpinning for our knowledge, we're all just talking nonsense here. Perhaps, because all evolution would indicate is that evolution has allowed us to develop certain abilities that allow us to survive, that allow us to adapt. There's no guarantee whatsoever that something that allows us to adapt and survive actually ties us into the truth. To have an assurance that the world is intelligible, both the factual world and the moral world, we need a God to give us that cognitive ability, to give us the assurance that we can know the truth. You're not going to get that simply by assuming, well, things evolved in a certain way, we developed these neurons or whatever, and yeah, well, fine. Evolution indicates we developed those things because they allowed us to, our ancestors reproduce, et cetera, survive various things, and that's all. It doesn't show that it gives us access to the truth. The fine-tuning argument, I didn't understand my opponent's response. He talked about something about throwing paint on the wall and, hey, it's possible that, something that had 1/60th of a millionth of a chance to be there could have been there. I don't think I denied that. I said, oh yeah, my argument from design can't establish beyond any doubt whatsoever that there's a designer. But again, the proposition we're debating here tonight is what is more probable? Is it more probable that given all the various things that had to fall right into place for there to be a universe and that for there to be life, that there was a designer that established those physical laws? Or is it more likely that paint was thrown on the wall and it formed a pattern that somehow reveals an underlying reality, a pattern that shows the world is intelligible, a pattern that allows us to make deductions about moral values? Yeah, you can believe that if you want. You can believe any sort of fantastical things. There's probably a 1 in 60th million chance that there are pixies in this room, right? We can't rule that out completely. There's probably a 1 in 60th millionth chance that I'm not here right now, that you're fantasizing things, that you've had too much of the scotch that I've been drinking. All those things are possible, but what is more likely? That's what we're debating here tonight, and I've yet to hear a response why it's not the case that it's more likely that there's a designer that established these physical constants that, again, reputed scientists such as Stephen Hawking say, are very unlikely. They had to be just so for for us to have a universe and for us to have life. And again, I'm eagerly awaiting some sort of response from my opponent on that point.
In his closing statement, the Reverend just switched around. He said he was making a fine-tuning argument, but then he started using the argument from design. Well, the two are actually in conflict if you think about it, because if the universe was designed by an all-powerful designer, why is it so precarious that the slightest alteration of this or that would make the universe collapse in on itself? So the way the Reverend portrays it is God designed the universe, and the moment he created it after the Big Bang, he said, uh-oh, I better fine-tune it or it'll collapse in on itself. So if the universe was designed so intelligently, why are things balanced so precariously that the slightest shift in something is going to bring about its recollapse? Now, he said he did not mention the Bible, and that's true. However, his refraining from mentioning the Bible doesn't stop me from bringing it up, because I'm saying an attribute of an all-knowing, all-good, all-loving God that wants us to know him is that he would give us a revelation that's reliable. If the revelation is not reliable, then that is an argument against his existence. You'll notice with all of his claims of objective moral values, he did not show us where he believes those values have been deposited. He wouldn't say if those values inhere in the Bible. The Reverend wouldn't say if he disagrees with the Bible's command that gays and women who commit adultery and women who practice witchcraft and people who pick up sticks on the Sabbath should be put to death. He refused to say where God has located those moral values for us to find it. So on the one hand, he says we can't have these values without God's existence, but he refuses to say if they're located in the Bible or anywhere else. Now, he talked about how any of us can perceive God and God is not hidden, but yes, God is hidden, because he talked about the warrant of our experience, and we have to be able to conduct our lives with some assurance. That's exactly it. Our experience and the assurance of our lives from our daily existence shows us that everything we do is governed by laws of the natural universe. There's nothing in our warranted daily experience that demonstrates anything supernatural, and yet he says there's enough evidence for a supernatural God. He has failed to carry his burden of proof on that point. And he talked about how fine-tuning is something that is so rare and it must have a divine hand. He has not demonstrated that even if there is an improbability factor, he hasn't shown a whole bunch of life-prohibiting universes by which we can compare this universe to be able to even assess the percentage improbability of this universe being life-affirming. And he has not demonstrated how the physical constants in our universe required a supernatural intervention. He was not able to show that the physical laws of our universe are such that they could not be what they are unless there was supernatural intervention. He also had no proof that the God he champions jump-started the universe from a place outside of time. And if it did, he needs to show us how that happened. How could an incorporeal being, not acting in time and space, which is the only way we know how cause and effect plays out, how can an incorporeal being affect time and space outside of time? It has to be demonstrated, or it is an incoherent proposition. You just can't assert God did it and God did it miraculously. So to talk about an inscrutable, all-powerful being that acted in a magical way is not an explanation of anything. All it does is compound the mystery. So, therefore, unless he is able to show us the process by which the laws of nature, in his words, we have come to expect as warranted experience can be violated, he's failed to carry his burden of proof, and the weight of the evidence still demonstrates it is more likely than not that there is no God.